Boa tarde, good afternoon, professor. Boa tarde, todo mundo. Hoje teremos aqui, eu tenho a honra de entrevistar o professor Ryan Enos, da Universidade de Harvard. Ele é professor na disciplina de governo e diretor do Centro de Estudos Políticos Americanos da Universidade de Harvard, nos Estados Unidos. É associado também do Instituto de Pesquisas Quantitativas e também de Análises Geográficas. Então, acredito que é bastante interessante para o canal aqui de Geografia Política da UNB. Ele é autor de um interessante livro, e por isso eu o convidei. Ele fez um livro bastante interessante e que faz a gente refletir bastante sobre a geografia eleitoral, o papel da geografia na explicação do fenômeno eleitoral. Então, eu acredito que seja bastante importante, seria interessante trazê-lo aqui para conversar sobre a sua obra, porque é um livro que mexe com a gente, mexe com considerações sobre geografia, sobre política, sobre eleições. Então, é uma reflexão bastante interessante que ele faz a partir da sociedade americana, mas com outros exemplos também de Israel, de Jerusalém, enfim, que pode nos servir bastante para pensar não só realidades estrangeiras, mas também pensar as eleições no Brasil. Essa live está sendo feita pelo canal Geografia Política UNB, que tem várias outras lives já gravadas. No início da pandemia era com mais frequência, depois agora nesse momento já de volta, felizmente, estamos fazendo algo mais semestral. Então esse seria o evento do semestre, e peço... É um evento que está sendo em parceria com o Instituto de Ciências de Humanidades da UNB e do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Geografia também da UNB. Então, ele vai ser totalmente em inglês. A partir de agora, eu vou começar a falar inglês com o professor, mas depois vou colocar a legenda para ser melhor divulgado. So, first of all, Professor, I would like to thank you a lot because you accept my invitation to this lecture. So it's going to be, I think, amazing for everybody here to hear about your book. I have to say that I love it. I have to say that it was very nice to read it and think about it, because there are so many things we can realize maybe about elections, not even in the United States or Israel, that countries that you studied, but even in Brazil also. So I want to say thank you. I know that this time is a little difficult to participate in this kind of meetings, because there are so many people trying to do lives, and we are kind of tired of this environment. But I think the opposite way, maybe this was the best way to meet each other, to see and hear you. So maybe it's something good we can get from this pandemic situation environment, right? So first, I would like to say thank you, and second, I would like to congratulate you about the book. It was very, very, very nice to hear, to read it, and to understand your arguments about it. Okay, so we have, as I told you, we have an audience that normally they don't speak English. So my goal is, after this, I'm gonna subtitle it and show around this interview. So maybe at the end I can ask some questions, but normally the people here in Brazil, they don't speak English very well, so it's going to be difficult for them to understand now your lecture. But I hope in the future I can show around and people can enjoy it as much as I will enjoy now. Okay, so thank you again. You have around like 30 minutes, and I give you now the word.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. If you can put my slides up, please.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you, and thank you, Daniel, for the invitation, and thanks for letting me come and talk about my work virtually. As we were discussing, Brazil's country, and Brasilia in particular, is a place that's always fascinated me, and I hope I'll get a chance to visit there sometime. And part of it is, wherever I go, I think about the things I study, about geography and politics, and I think there'd be so much interesting to learn about there in Brazil, and see how the things I'm going to talk about here, whether those apply in Brazil. And I'll be curious to hear your thoughts and the thoughts of others about that, if they have a chance to tell me. And so I am going to speak about my book, The Space Between Us, which is about social geography and politics. I released this about 5 years ago, and I'm always looking to see if I still think it's relevant, and you can help me decide. So one way I like to introduce this is with this quote from my former colleague, Bob Putnam, that he said when he received the Skype Prize for his work in political science. He said one of the most important challenges facing modern societies, and at the same time, one of the most significant opportunities, is the increase in ethnic and social heterogeneity in virtually all advanced countries. The most certain prediction that we can make about almost any modern society is that it'll be more diverse a generation from now than it is today. And I think that what Putnam said over 15 years ago is shown to be true. And in many ways, my book is an attempt to think about how the geography of this diversity, how this affects whether or not this diversity leads to challenges or whether it leads to opportunities. And I'll show you some of my work that has demonstrated how diversity and how the geography of that diversity can shape outcomes in politics and other places in other outcomes in a society. And so what this book is about, it's about the powerful impact of social geography on our individual behavior and on the well-being of society. And I try to show how much geography impacts the way we behave. And I make this claim, I say that geography penetrates our psychology. It affects the very way we perceive other groups. And with these changes in perception, it affects our behavior, and ultimately it affects our politics. And so as an example of this, I like to start with Chicago. This city was my former home, and I just gave away the answer. I was going to say sometimes I've shown this to non-American audiences, and I like to ask them if they know what city it is. And I started to say that the answer to this is Chicago. And a lot of people know this, even if you're not familiar with Chicago, even if you've never been there, even if you're not an American. You're familiar with this. And one reason is people are familiar with the city is the pattern that we see there of the racial geography of the city. So this is a map showing the percent African American by these small geographies called census tracts in Chicago, where the darker areas are more African American or more Black in Chicago, and the other areas are made up of other ethnicities. And you can see this stark segregation where African Americans or Blacks are segregated on the south and the west sides of the city. And what I ask people to consider is this reality of Chicago, and then consider how the politics of Chicago would be changed if it looked more like this situation here on the other side of the screen, for example. And this is just a situation where I randomly took these census tracts in Chicago and moved them around the city to make it less segregated. And what I contend is that the politics of a place like Chicago would be a lot less divisive and a lot less conflictual if the city was not segregated in the way it is. And other American cities and other cities across the world have a similar phenomenon of this segregation, and maybe it would be less conflictual if they're less segregated than Chicago or these other cities are now. And I'll show you some evidence for that as I go along. So to underpin this argument I'm going to make, what I claim is I say that, there's different types of space, not only geographic space, but also, of course, the psychological, social, and political spaces that we have in our head or that we share with other people. And that these spaces are intertwined in our minds, affecting how we see ourselves and other people in each. And so when groups are separated in geographic space, it drives these groups further apart in our mind. We assume they're more different than they actually are in psychological space. And that causes us to separate from these groups in social and political space. And that affects the politics of a society. And so what I claim is that group-based bias, and what I mean by that, by group-based bias, is when one treats their in-group better than an out-group. And these can be racial groups or ethnic groups or religious groups or any other groups. I claim that group-based bias is greatest when there's a proximate out-group, a group that's different than the in-group, that is large and segregated. And that this bias manifests when groups come together in spaces and institutions. That when they have to share places like neighborhoods, we see bias in those neighborhoods. When groups come together in things like schools, we can see bias in those schools. Sometimes they have to come together and decide in legislative bodies and in elections and so on. And we see a bias in these places when there's this manifestation of group-based bias from groups that are large and segregated from each other. And so I show evidence for this in this book. And part of the evidence I show is this wide-scale evidence from the United States. And so, for example, I look at maps like this, and I look at the geography of places like this, and look at things like metro areas in the United States, city areas in the United States, and ask how segregated they are. And this is a map of the segregation between blacks and whites in the United States, the darker places being the cities that are more segregated. And you can see a similar phenomenon, for example, if I look at the segregation between Hispanic and Anglos, between Spanish speakers and English speakers in the United States, we see similar maps of segregation where we can see cities where those places where those groups are more segregated and places where they're less segregated. And if you look at these patterns of segregation, you can see that the segregation and the size of the outgroup are associated with a lot of outcomes, such as privately held negative attitudes about the outgroup. We can actually see this in the way people search Google. If they're searching for negative attitudes about the group, those findings are correlated with the size of the outgroup and the segregation of that outgroup. But we don't just see it in private behavior. We can see it in the way people respond to surveys. They express more negative attitudes about the outgroup on surveys. And we can see this in the way people vote as well, on whether or not they turn out to vote. Now, this, in my opinion, shows this compelling association between segregation and the size of the outgroup and these behaviors, both people's attitudes and their political behavior, whether they vote and how they vote as well. But one thing we might ask, of course, one of the questions that this raises is whether this is really due to segregation, because of course there's lots of other things that are going on in these cities besides just the segregation of the groups. There could be things that are confounding this relationship. And so if we really want to understand whether segregation and the size of the outgroup are causing these behaviors that we see, what we want to be able to do is to actually do something like change segregation, change the local geography of a place, and understand if when that geography changes, whether people's behavior, whether their political behavior and their attitudes change as well. And so much of my book is an attempt to look and see what happens when geography changes and see how politics and behavior change along with that. And so one of the first places we did that was actually to go into a laboratory and change geography on a small scale and see if attitudes and behaviors can be changed when geography is changed on a small scale. And so we actually did this by going into a classroom. That was our laboratory, a classroom at Harvard, and bringing people into this classroom, recruiting them off the internet, and bringing people into this classroom and assigning them to what are known as minimal groups, which if you're familiar with a lot of social psychology, you may see this, what's called this minimal groups paradigm, where we assign them to these meaningless groups that we call type H and type Y, that were not based on any actual characteristics of the people. And what we did is after assigning them to these people to these groups that came into this classroom together, we then randomly assigned them to one of two different situations, depending on when they came to the classroom. In one situation, the individuals were divided up by groups. They were segregated by groups. And that's what you see down here in this situation, where all the Ys are on one side of the classroom and all the H's are on the other side. In a different situation, we mixed these Y's and H's together so they're more integrated across space. And then we left these groups sitting there for just 5 minutes. It was only 5 minutes. So they were either segregated for 5 minutes or integrated for 5 minutes. And after these individuals had been assigned these meaningless groups, were either segregated or integrated for 5 minutes, we then sent them off into their own room, individuals into their own room, with an opportunity to collect data on their behaviors and their attitudes. And what we found this situation of being segregated or integrated actually changed the way they saw this other meaningless group. It changed the way they thought about them and the way they behaved about them. So what we saw was that when minimal groups were segregated rather than integrated, they actually thought that the physical differences between these groups increased, and that the social differences between these groups increased. And they actually changed the way they behave. There's actually bias and sharing of real money between the groups. That increased as well in what's known as a dictator game. And so just to show you some of that briefly, what we found was when we asked them questions like on average, what is the feet and height of inches in inches, because it's in the United States, what is the feet and height of people in these groups, and what is their average weight in pounds, and how old are they, for example. We found that when people guessed at these physical characteristics of these groups, the difference between those groups actually got larger in their minds when they were segregated compared to when they were integrated. And we asked about social characteristics as well. We asked them to guess about people's politics, for example, and how much money people have, and whether they have things in common. And we found that in that situation, the differences between groups actually grew as well in the segregated condition compared to the integrated condition. The other thing we did is we actually gave people an opportunity to actually have costly bias. So we had them play with what's known as a dictator game, which is simply where a person's given an endowment of money. They're given 10 American dollars, and they're given an opportunity to share that money with other people in their in-group and people in their out-group. And what we found is, of course, like it usually goes when people play these dictator games, is most people just kept all the money and took it for themselves. But some people did indeed share. And when people shared, the difference in sharing between the in-group and the out-group grew when these groups were segregated. And it grew to about 40 cents, which may not seem like a lot, but given that most people kept all their money, it was somewhat meaningful. So what this showed was the situation of segregation actually caused people to discriminate in giving more to the out-group than they would in the situation when they were integrated. Now, so what we found, just to recap that, was that keeping people together in this laboratory, in this classroom, in these meaningless groups for just 5 minutes actually changed people's behavior. Now, one thing you might be asking, of course, is, well, does this mean anything for groups in the real world, groups in real cities, and groups that are meaningful, that mean something to people, like ethnic groups or religious groups? And my claim is that it does. And we can see that with the other evidence from the book. In fact, one of the things I claimed was that because this is a theory that's rooted in our basic psychology, it's supposed to be applicable anywhere, and that we can find groups and geography anywhere in the world, and we should see the same phenomenon that we saw in the laboratory in other parts of the world. And so one way we put to the test was actually leaving the United States, where I'd accumulated most of my evidence, and going to Israel and studying how the geography of groups in Israel impacted the relationship between each other. Now, the groups we studied in Israel were actually the conflict between what we might think of as a secular Jewish population, which is most of the population in Israel, and what is known as the ultra-Orthodox population, Jewish population in Israel, which is a small religious minority with distinctive dress and other characteristics that sets them apart from the Jewish majority. And what we did is we went around to a series of different cities in Israel that had different levels of segregation and different levels of outgroup population. And we had them play some of these same games that we had them play in the laboratory in Harvard, and saw if the segregation in these cities was related to the behavior that people would exhibit towards the outgroup in the same way that we saw in the laboratory. What we did is we had people play on a computer where they could see the identity of the outgroup and recognize it based on the distinctive dress and the distinctive names and other characteristics of the outgroup. When they played on this computer, we then measured things like their bias in giving and sharing based on games that we had in play. And what we found, and this is what this graph represents, is that as the size of the outgroup got larger, that bias in sharing and giving got larger. And when the segregation of the outgroup got larger, that bias in sharing and giving got larger as well. So what we actually saw was the same phenomenon that we saw in the laboratory among this Jewish population in Israel. We saw that segregation in these cities in Israel had the same effect on people's behavior as we saw in the laboratory. So one of the questions that comes out of this, of course, one thing we might ask is, we've shown this powerful effect of segregation, at least in my mind, I've shown this powerful effect of segregation. But a question that might arise is, people don't always live in a segregated environment. So what happens when that segregation breaks down, when people start to come across these segregated environments? What happens to people's behavior? And in many ways, that's the phenomenon we see, for example, the phenomenon of immigration in societies that experience a lot of immigration, like the United States or Brazil, for example. We see people coming into a country and the situation of people being separated breaking down, and we might ask how that affects people's behavior. And so one of the places that I studied that, asking what happens as segregation breaks down, is in Boston, here where I live now, and asking how immigration to a place like Boston affects people's behavior. And in doing so, I asked people to think about thinking about this same sort of counterfactual phenomenon that I saw in that showed you at the beginning of when I talked, and asking if Boston wasn't segregated like it is here. This is the segregation between Anglos and Hispanics in Boston, so between Spanish speakers and non-Spanish speakers, but rather it was more mixed up, like in this other graphic I showed you. Would we see the same phenomenon that I'm about to show you? And my feeling is, no, we would not, that the reaction to immigrants would be very different in a non-segregated society. So what we did in this experiment in Boston was we asked this question of what happens when two immigrants, and I've got immigrants in quotation marks, so they weren't actually immigrants, visit a train platform. I took advantage of the fact that there's these commuter rail lines. There's these rail lines in Boston, and this is what this is a map of, where people get on trains out in the suburbs of Boston and ride them into the city every day at about the same time every day to go to work. And what I wanted to ask was, what would happen if in these communities out in the suburbs of Boston that are largely Anglo-white communities, what would happen if immigrants started to move into those communities? Would the attitudes of people in Boston in these communities outside of Boston, would their attitudes about politics and other phenomenon change as immigration started to increase in their communities? Now, one way you could study that, of course, is you could say, well, we could take some money if we had a lot of it, and we could go move immigrants into these communities and see if people's attitudes change. But of course, we can't do that for a lot of different reasons. So we wanted to come up with a way that we could think about simulating immigration, see if we could come up with a way that seemed like there was immigration, even if immigration was not really happening. And that's where these commuter rail lines come in. So because people catch these trains every day at the same time, we were able to take people that were Spanish-speaking actors, Confederates in the words of experiments, a Confederate or an actor that worked for me, and putting them at these train platforms out in these communities. These are the red dots on the map that you see, putting them out in the communities on those red dots, and at the same time every day, with the idea that people that rode those trains would see these Spanish-speaking people on the train platform, be exposed to the Spanish language, and then that their attitudes might change compared to a control group that was not exposed to these Spanish-speaking actors at the same time every day. In doing so, to measure these attitudes, we did a survey of the people on these train platforms before and after I introduced this putatively immigrant population to see how their attitudes changed compared to a control group. So what we saw is we asked them a series of questions about their attitudes about immigration to see if this would change. We asked them whether the number of immigrants in the country should be increased, whether the children of undocumented immigrants should be allowed to stay, which is a question that's often of relevance in politics, of relevance to the politics of immigration in the United States, and actually whether English should be the official language of the United States. The United States has no official language, but this is a question that comes up occasionally. And what we saw was, and this is what these dots on here represent, you can concentrate on the black dots first, is after just a few days of being exposed to these putative immigrants, that people's attitudes on these issues moved in a conservative direction, meaning they became more restrictive towards immigration. That's what those black dots represent. So being exposed for just a few minutes every day moved these Anglos in the western part of Massachusetts in a more conservative direction about immigration when they were exposed to this group, and this process of segregation sort of started to break down. One thing we found, though, that was quite interesting was we also surveyed people at a later time after they'd been exposed for a few more days, these same immigrants. And that's what these gray dots on this graph represent. And what we can see is that these dots start to move back towards zero representing the place where their attitude started. And what this may mean is that people's attitudes moved away from this restrictive immigrant attitude as time went on. Perhaps they got used to seeing these people in their community. Perhaps they decided they weren't bad, they weren't dangerous, something like that. And their attitudes actually started to return towards normal. And we might think of that as this phenomenon that psychologists study of intergroup contact, whereas segregation breaks down. At first, there's some kind of conflict, but perhaps over time, people get used to each other and their attitudes start to normalize, and people can actually learn to live together in a way that makes societies better off in the long run. One thing that was very interesting about studying Boston is, even though I had just done this with just a few people for a few minutes every day, what we could see in Boston was a phenomenon that perhaps is something that we could see play out in different communities across the United States. So after I finished the first draft of my book, the 2016 election happened in the United States in a way that shocked the consciousness of a lot of Americans, because Donald Trump was running on a platform where a large part of the platform was about anti-immigrant policy, and a lot of what he did was to implement that policy when he took office. And so one thing I decided to look at, given these results I had in Boston, was to see if there was a relationship between the growth of an immigrant population in a county in the United States, in these small sub-state units, and a shift towards Donald Trump in the 2016 election compared to 2012. And that's indeed what I found. That's what this graph represents. So what we saw in these counties in the United States was similar to the phenomenon we saw in Boston in this experiment I did, where as the counties became more heavily Hispanic, in this case, as an immigrant population came in, that they shifted towards a candidate that wanted to be more restrictive on immigration. One last point about Boston, and then I'll move on to one more city, and then I'll close, is that this claim I made about this being a phenomenon that you could see all over, that I think you can see all over the world, means that you should be able to see it with different groups and in different places at different times. And in studying Boston, one thing I did was to go back and ask people that had experienced a similar wave of immigration in Boston back in the 1960s and 70s, and seen what phenomenons they saw then. And in many ways, this is an interesting thing to look at in particular, because it was internal immigration, not external immigration, that we're interested in. When the Black or African American population of the United States moved out of the southern United States towards places like cities like Boston in the north and the west of the United States, to see how attitudes of people in a way that may have affected the attitudes and politics of those places. And what I did was I interviewed police officers in Boston that had worked in what was known as a racialized crime unit, where they were looking for crimes that had occurred between people based on their racial identity. Crimes between Black people and white people, where they're fighting over neighborhoods, doing things like throwing bricks in people's houses, starting fights over these neighborhoods being contested. And one of the most striking conversations I had was when a police officer in Boston drew this map that I'm showing you here, where they drew these lines on this map to show me where most of this conflict had happened. And then I was able to take this map and then compare it to historical data on where these groups came together. And this is this map I'm showing you here, where the Black population and the white population in Boston met across these lines of segregation that had been drawn. And what I saw was that where he described these crimes happening, was very much in line with these segregated boundaries, where groups would meet in the middle and have an opportunity. These large and proximate groups would meet across this segregation, and conflict would arise. So the situation I described in Boston was a situation of a small population moving into a city because of my experiment, and seeing how that would affect people's attitudes. And one thing we might ask is, what does this do if this is a large population, like I just showed you in this example in Boston? Do we see evidence for a large population? And thinking about things like these countries diversifying in the way that Robert Putnam described when I first started, when a society is met by a large population of change, how does that affect people's attitudes? Because perhaps that's what we care about. And the place that I looked for evidence for this was to look at a phenomenon in Chicago, where there was a large change to the social geography, and to see how that affected the attitudes and the behaviors of people in Chicago. This was to say what I just said to you, where I said a small scale change is not what we actually care about. I sent 2 putative immigrants to a train platform. And although we did see a change in attitudes, we don't believe 2 immigrants is actually a very big deal. So what happens when there's a lot more than 2 immigrants? To study this, I looked at a phenomenon in Chicago that was known as public housing. In this case, these are a particular public housing project known as the Robert Taylor Homes. And these were large state-controlled housing that used to exist in much larger numbers than it does now in the United States, that were overwhelmingly populated by poor minority residents, mostly in this case by Black residents of Chicago that lived in these large housing blocks in Chicago and other places. What happened between the years about 2000 and 2004, and then more slowly over time after that, was the state made a decision that they wanted to tear down this housing for various reasons. And so the housing was torn down and left looking like this, and then eventually replaced by other housing. And when it was torn down, this large minority population that was living there was moved to other parts of the city. Now, what was interesting in particular, and what was interesting to me about these places in Chicago, was many of these large-scale housing projects that housed tens of thousands of Black people were approximate to neighborhoods that were made up mostly of white voters. And so in many ways, when this Black population was moved, it was the reverse, but in very large numbers, of this situation that I saw in Boston. In Boston, there was a new group coming in, and that changed people's attitudes in a direction that was more conservative towards that population. And what I saw here was a population was moved away. And we might ask what happened to people's behavior after that population was moved away. And that's what I studied. So just to show you this on a map, what we see Chicago here with these, and again, colored by the percent African American and the percent Black in these geographic units. And these white dots are these housing projects. And I looked to see how the population of these areas changed over time after these housing projects were demolished. And you can see where some of these white dots are, that the proportion of African Americans living around those, not in all cases, but in many of these cases, was reduced dramatically. And so what I'm trying to do is to compare the behavior of the white residents that live near these housing projects and all of a sudden saw their African American neighbors leave. I'm trying to compare their behavior to white people that lived around projects that either were not demolished or further away from the projects, and see how their behavior changed, how their political behavior changed as well. So what we found was that the voter turnout, whether or not people voted, actually went down dramatically after the housing projects were demolished compared to this control population, which it didn't. That's what these dots represent here. The gray or white dots represent white voters that live near these housing projects. And we see that their propensity to vote went down dramatically. The x-axis of this graph represents the distance from the housing projects. That tendency to have their vote reduced got smaller and smaller as you went away from the housing projects. It was the people that lived closest that saw their behavior change dramatically after the demolition of the housing projects. Similarly, for Black people that live near the housing projects, their behavior changed very little. And so one thing we might take away from that was this presence of this outgroup, this Black population living in the housing projects, and that previously had been stimulating the vote of these residents, that had made them excited about politics, that perhaps had been threatening to them and caused them to vote. And when that population moved away, that their tendency to vote went down. So I've gone over a number of cities here. I went all the way from a laboratory in Boston, all the way to Jerusalem, then back to Boston, and then to Chicago. In studying this book, I was able to look at a lot of different places as well that I didn't talk about. I spent some time in Phoenix, and we spent some time talking about in Los Angeles. And there was a lot of other phenomenon that I studied. And a lot of it comes together in this picture of asking what happens when people are segregated, yet proximate and in large groups next to each other. And a lot of the behavior that I pointed to was behavior that seems to be able to be called conflictual behavior, that looks like it leads to conflict in politics. There's a flip side of this that I didn't take the time to talk about today, which is how that conflictual behavior can then be reduced so that societies can live in harmony. And I'm happy to spend more time talking about that or anything else that's of interest. And once again, thanks for letting me have the opportunity to come here and share my research.
Thank you, Ryan, so much. I read your book, so for me to see you explaining those things and it reminds me what I read. So a lot of questions again pop up in my head just to ask you. So for me, your book is interesting for at least two things, like two major and big things. First is because you got in a debate, very interesting debate, that if context or geography matters, or only social class and other social things matter for the elections, right? So even in Political Geography Journal, like 20 years ago, there was like a big debate between, of course you know about it, that there's a big debate between geographers say, yes, geography matters, and other authors say, no, it doesn't matter, only matter social class and group things. So your book was amazing because it shows and confirm, and I'm a geographer, so that's why I'm very happy about it, actually. So confirm that geography matters to electoral studies, right?
Yeah.
So how do you answer people that say that geography is in second position to understand electoral studies? First, there are other things like, for example, social class and how do you respond that?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I love the example you brought up in the geography journals, because that's something that I teach in my classes. And many of the people that were arguing that geography didn't matter are my colleagues, actually. So this was a particular argument I like to have with them, and I think that the first way that one may answer that is, of course, to think about this intuitively and think about a thought experiment. And the thought experiment I asked somebody to think about is to say, well, if you took a person and you took their culture, you could take a person, for example, from Brazil and move them to the United States, just pick them up and drop them in this thought experiment. Would we expect their behavior and their politics to stay absolutely the same as they were in Brazil? And the answer, I think all of us would intuitively say no, because people learn and they change from their environments, and they change because who's around them. And we've all experienced this. If we think about our lives, think about when we left home and went to college or something like that, we see our behavior change. Now, of course, that person that we picked up and moved from Brazil to the United States, or from the United States to Brazil or wherever, their behavior might not change entirely. They may, for example, never become completely integrated into a society. So we might think that those characteristics of them, either the fact that they came from a different culture or the fact that they have a certain income or something, of course, does have a stickiness to it. But what that means is, if we think about it intuitively, it has to be a mix of these two things. Geography has to have an effect on people. And of course, other characteristics of a person has to have an effect as well. The trick is figuring out which one is, how important each one is. And one reason I think perhaps that we think that characteristics like social class and such are more important is because in many ways they're easier to study. We can just ask people about them on a survey, for example, but it's harder to do this with geography. And so I think that one of the things I was able to do in my book, and one of the reasons it had some successful contributions to scholarship, was to be able to show the causal effect of geography, to look at these sort of natural experiments when these housing projects were demolished, or to do an experiment in my own laboratory or in Boston to show that when you do change geography, you can see its powerful impact. And as an example of that, keep in mind, for example, these people in Boston that had their attitudes change about immigration in a more conservative direction, these were liberal people. These were liberal people that had been voting for Democrats in the United States and then saw their attitudes become more conservative. So whatever it was that was making them a liberal changed when their geography changed around them. And in many ways, I think that's a powerful demonstration of the effect of geography.
Yeah, that's very interesting. For example, I'm from Rio in Brazil. Now I'm living in Brasilia.
Yeah.
Segregation in Brazil, it's a very sadly, it's a very common phenomenon in my country, but especially here in Brasilia, I am now in the most segregated city in the country. So
really,
yeah, so here's, if you see any data about it, it's the most segregated city in Brazil. It's Brasilia. So when I was reading your book, I was trying to think how to measure actually
right,
the difference in perspectives and electoral studies in Brasilia, in other cities in Brazil about segregation. And so first, as I told you, for me it was amazing too, because your book can help us to understand how geography matters besides social class and so on. So that was very nice. And second thing, I would like to ask you and talk a little more. It's about methodology, because you were very worried about it all the time. It was actually kind of funny that all the time in your book you were explaining how dangerous and how problematic could be the methodology you're choosing in that moment. So
right,
you were saying, "I'm sorry, but I'm gonna give you another methodology." So you use like different kind of quantitative and qualitative methodology. So that was very nice to see. And because normally in geography we have a problem that people say that geography studies can be deterministic. We
right,
say that people are like they are because they live in those places, so they can be people can see that's not very nice thing to say. You are
right.
the you know. So when you use different methodology, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you're worried about it, right? You're worried about the conclusions you can make after your research, right?
Yep. Yeah, that's 100% correct. And I think and in many of the discussions I've had about my book, a lot of it has been about the conclusions people are making. And that's why I try to show them across a lot of different places and using a lot of different methodologies about the complexity of the situation and about why you need to understand it from a lot of different angles in order to understand the nuance of what happens when different groups come together and how we can make the groups better, or how we can make society better when we live in a diverse society. And so I think, as a social scientist, the reason that has to be done is, there's no one perfect method, right? There can be disadvantages for any of them, right? We when we go and we talk to people, when we interview people, we use qualitative methods. Of course, you learn so many deep and rich things about people, but there can be bias that's introduced from yourself. It's hard to know what causes something, for example. And then there's other problems too. When we think about, for example, when we look at observational data and we look across the United States, like I did, we get this beautiful view of the whole country. But of course, we don't know, as I mentioned, if that's something that's causing something. We don't know if that geography is doing it. So then we might ask if we can do an experiment. And so I go and do experiments. But there's a problem with those experiments. So then I think about whether I can do a laboratory study, for example. And it's always this conversation between these different, or I should say, after the experiment, I go to see if I can do interviews, for example. And so I think that with a social science problem, because the world is so complex and so hard to understand, we just have to attack it from a lot of different ways in order to actually understand.
Yeah, that's right. I think we all have these problems when we are doing our research.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you can choose one methodology you chose in your study, which one would be the best to achieve this goal you got it.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, that's part of, that's tough, right? Because that's what I'm saying is there's no one best thing. I mean, I do think that one of the reasons that, and this goes back to the first question you asked me, I think one of the reasons that this book had made a contribution was that I was able to leverage, for example, experiments to study geography. And not many people had done that before, right? As geographers have their own way of doing things, and it often doesn't involve experiments. And then even political scientists that study geography don't think about how we can think about experiments to study geography. And so I think my ability to do that, it's not perfect, of course, and it leaves other things on the table. And that's why I bring other methods. But I think it did allow people to think about the causal effect of geography in a way that was harder before we started doing those experiments.
Yeah, yeah. I think one conclusion that we I think we have to avoid that that different people, to live between different people is something bad, right? So because when you see in your book, we see that when different people arrives, and when I say different, it depends where we are. Different in Brazil is different in the United States,
Yep.
of course. But when you see that, it seems that for us to live with different people, it's something bad for ourselves,
Right.
and vote like
Right.
I can say vote bad. I can say that, but yeah, maybe yeah. We vote in a different direction we would vote before because the existence of a different people.
Right.
So and we can see that very very in an aggressive way in Jerusalem, in Israel,
Sure.
as you showed. So I think I think we are. There is a question.
Mhm.
A student is watching us. Can
Yeah.
I ask you his question?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Uh, he's asking. I'm trying to translating now because it's in Portuguese.
Yeah.
Uh,
I'm
so
impressed that you can do that.
no, it's messy. But okay. He's asking how we can understand the election of Trump uh, when we associate the strong immigration in the United States
Yeah.
and the segregation. So immigration segregation can explain the election of Trump a few years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I think it can, and actually, this relates to the point you were just making, Daniel, which is, one of the conclusions I don't want people to take away from my book is that that is bad when people get together, right? And if you read it and you're not careful, maybe that's what you would say. You'd be like, oh, it's bad because people fight and they do all those things. But there's so many benefits that come from diversity, right? Like one of the reasons that the United States and Brazil are interesting and successful countries is because people do come together, right? And their societies are born from a lot of different types of people. And so we think about the benefits from those. And then what we ask though is how can we make those places successful? And this speaks to this question about Trump and about segregation. And I do think it was groups coming together, but politicians exploiting that in many ways that led to Trump. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. So what I looked at was really short-term changes to geography when people had first come together across segregation. So you had these places in the United States that had almost no Hispanic immigrants. And then the population changed rapidly. And when it changed, people were driven towards voting for Trump by that rapid change. Now, you see that in all kinds of places across the world. It happens in places in the United States, in places like Boston, in this example I gave with the trains. It happens you can see it in Chicago. You could see it all over the United States at various times throughout history. And in many ways, Trump was just another phenomenon of that. But what happens then is a question we need to ask ourselves is what happens when those groups are together for a longer time after there's that initial change and people live together for a longer time. Would they still keep voting for Trump or would they still keep having this reaction to immigrants? And the best evidence we can see is that the answer is no, that over time, people learn to live with each other and they're able to harness those benefits of diversity and they learn to live in harmony. In many ways, society is better off. But it's often because people were segregated from each other in the first place that when they come into contact, that there is that initial conflict that drives people to do things like vote for Trump. And so the thing we might ask is how can we make people more integrated in the first place so they have an opportunity to get to know each other and live together and have a chance to get to know each other in a way that leads to more peace and harmony. Then, the other part of it, of course, is we should say we have politicians that don't try to exploit these situations, which is, I think, very much what Trump did. But that's a different issue.
Yeah. And so you're saying that social geography impacts in a more short time, like?
Well, I think that there's two phenomenon here, and this is a good question. So the question is, when we have a situation of segregation, in many ways, groups are always initially segregated. When they first come together, when that segregation first breaks down, you see this big impact where you have people move apart from each other in their minds. Groups become more prominent, they move apart. But the thing that happens at the same time is people get a chance to know each other as individuals. They get to know each other either by going to school with people or having friends, working with people, and that individual contact works against this phenomenon of social segregation. And one of the chapters I didn't talk about in my book was looking at this in neighborhoods in Los Angeles that have become heavier and heavier Spanish speaking over time. And you saw this initial conflict between the Black population in Los Angeles and these Spanish speaking neighbors that came in. But over time, that conflict's largely gone away. And I think part of it is people just learn to live together and get along in this neighborhood like people do.
Nice. So I think for a research like yours, it takes like years of research, right? So this book is like the conclusion of how many years of research?
At least 9 years, maybe. I mean, I started writing it when I started some of that research I started to do when I was in graduate school, when I was in, and so it's parts of my dissertation, and then I just kept adding to it. And I think that's goes to this conversation we had about different methodologies. If you really want to nail something, you have to go at it from a lot of different directions, and that's what I did in that book. So yeah, it takes a long time, and the thinking about it goes back even further, because I first started thinking about these things when I moved to cities like Chicago and saw the way people live and started thinking about how that affects politics.
So just to finish this lecture, but I have to ask you that how are the response about your book? Like after you publish it, did you get some people criticizing?
Oh, of course.
Yeah. What kind of questions you heard more, and how did you answer it?
Yeah, well, so I get a lot of different criticisms, and that's part of the academic process, right? You put things out there, and people criticize, right? And that's good, because that's how we learn from the whether we're right or wrong. And I'm sure there's things I said in that book that will show to be maybe not entirely right, that we'll have to change what we think about them. And there's other things that I say that maybe will stand the test of time, and that's the way we learn in the world. And so part of it was there's different criticisms that come in. And some of the criticism came from geographers, where I would hear from geographers occasionally that didn't necessarily think that this was the right way to study geography, that they wanted to do more deep sort of, contextual research, doing interviews and things like that. And I think they're right about that. I think that's a great way to do things. But my response would be that you shouldn't shut out other ways of studying, right? That we learn from all these different ways, and we can learn from the way you're doing things, and you can learn from the way I was doing things, and all of that together helps us to understand. And some of the other things questions that people have a lot is about how we understand this relationship between Trump that one of your students asked about, and things like segregation. And that's a tricky question, because depending on how you measure these things, and this is why it's a scientific process, a complicated one, you get different answers depending on how you measure things in that. And so a lot of it was about whether or not the way I measured it is the right way to measure it. And there's still people that we argue about that. And I think it's important to know that, these conclusions are sensitive to the data you have, just like anything else. And you want to look at all the different ideas people put out there and decide which one's right.
Sure. And from I think it's your book is amazing for another thing too, because here not here, but only in social electoral studies. Normally they say that there are three major explanations for voting, right? So the rational choice,
right,
and the psychology explanations, and the social explanations.
Yeah.
And normally geography, electoral geography, it's not a fourth explanation. It's mixed between everything. So the way your book showed, maybe that's electoral geography is a fourth way to understand the voting. Yeah. And it's a fourth way, and you can mix, of course, because it's not separate, of course, but can influence the rational choice, the psychology, and the social explanation. So
right.
I think electoral geography, after this, your book had improved. So really, yeah. So I really I want to say thank you for two things. Thank you for your book, and thank you for accepting my invitation to this lecture, because I think and that's something sad about it, because it takes a lot of time to translate books
Right.
or English to Portuguese. So it's bad that we don't have translation process faster.
Right.
Of course, we have Google Translator and things like this, but it's not the same.
Right.
So I think this kind of lecture,
yeah,
I think, can help to spread a little more the paper, the book, and stuff. So thank you a lot, Ryan.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a real pleasure, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to share my research. And thank you for taking the time to translate it into Portuguese for this lecture, and then maybe eventually my book someday, and we can talk more.
I hope so. So thank you a lot again, and I hope we can keep in touch and do maybe some research between United States and Brazil. It'd be an amazing thing.
I look forward to that.
Okay. Bye, Ryan. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Again,